our folk theories of epistemology, our sort of folk theories about how things work, don't stand up to even the mildest scrutiny.
What do you mean by that?
In Western culture, particularly American culture, we sort of adopted from science our view of what epistemology is, i.e. you gather evidence and you sift through it and you reason from evidence to conclusions. But as you say from your anecdote about the world being round, the vast bulk of what we say we know based on trust. We know based on someone told us, and we believe them. So really, when it's about knowledge and how to know things, it's much less about the sort of individual process of inquiry or gathering evidence or sifting through it, and much more about who do we trust and how do we maintain that trust and how is that trust vouchsafed and what happens when that trust crumbles. What they've been overtaken by is what I call tribal epistemology, which is just sort of this distinction between what's good for us, right? What's our narrative? What's our side of things? What do we need to believe for political advantage? And what's true just collapses. They just become the same thing. It just becomes, we believe what's good for us to believe, they believe what's good for them to believe, and that's the end of the story. There's no referee above us who can decide between us. There are no sort of these transpartisan standards of evidence or reasoning don't exist. There are only tribes, our tribe and your tribe, your truth, our truth, and they're equally valid because that's how things work. So, it's taken time for this to sort of sink in and completely take over the right. Now it's just become frictionless. It's become effortless. Like, this is what I was writing about the caravan, the sort of migrant caravan invasion, quote unquote. There was not even a sort of pretense of going through the motions of pretending to find evidence that the caravan was a threat, right? They just skipped that whole part and just said, it's a terrible threat. And everyone on the right said, okay, it's a terrible threat. Like, even going through the motions of pretending like there's some sort of inquiry or knowledge, production happening has just fallen away. And they just, like, what do we need to believe in this situation? It's good for us to believe that the caravan is a threat, so we believe it. Boom. Like, that's how it is now. There's no self-checking. There's no gatekeeping from other trusted members of the right. Everyone, media, think tanks, right-wing media, right-wing think tanks, right-wing, lobbying groups in the federal government now
that's key.
Are all basically part of the same thing. There are no distinctions anymore. They're not checking each other. They're all part of the same project. So they all have the same perspective. They all believe the same things. Epistemologically, there's no self-correction remaining on the right.
You said something earlier just now that that I think is key is, it's really important, I think, to understand this, that there's a kind of cynicism here that the people on the right genuinely, truly believe about the left, right? So they think this is how it works everywhere. They think that like, their whole point is that, I think Rush Limbaugh once said that science, academia, and journalism were the pillars of deceit. Is that what he said?
The 4 pillars of deceit: science, journalism, academia, and media, dominated by the left, lying to you about everything. And there's this whole, and this was back in 2010. Yeah, and he basically says, and they set out to do this over decades. We have to build our own media, our own think tanks, our own science. Right? We're going to build our own parallel world of knowledge, and it's going to be just as valid as the left's because all they are is 2 versions of the same thing. It's not so much that they think that the left is doing the same thing as they don't. It's like trying to describe a rainbow to a colorblind person. I don't think they understand that there is another way of viewing it, right? I think they think everybody's just tribal, and all this talk that liberals do about skepticism and standards and self-correction and evidence, they're just bids, right? They're just maneuvers trying to gain advantage.
Right.
And so the right will adopt that language. They'll talk about evidence. They'll talk about proof. They'll talk about motivated reasoning. If you say fake news, they'll start saying fake news, right? Because they sense that those words and concepts have some power, right? Have some influence. But they're not using them the way the left is using them. They're talking about different things.
Well, and this is the thing, is that what happens if, like, when you put all of the main parts of knowledge production in a society, journalism, right? Journalism is part of knowledge production, right? You go out, you report facts. You say, I went to the scene of the shooting and I saw these shell casings. I talked to these police officers. I talked to these witnesses who says this happened, and then I come back and I report it out and I say these things happen. And academia, right, whose job is knowledge production and knowledge transmission, and science, which is part of academia, knowledge production, knowledge transmission, the media more broadly, right? If you take all of that, which are the main ways a society produces and disseminates knowledge, and you say that's all in the other camp,
right,
you have untethered yourself from all the institutional means that produce knowledge about the world.
Yes.
Which is what they have done.
And you are creating parallel institutions which do not have any of the self-correcting features and are designed purely to generate the conclusions you want. And you mistake that for being the same thing. And this, what you just said in a nutshell is the epistemic crisis. Namely, call it 30% of Americans have basically hived off from mainstream institutions of knowledge creation and knowledge verification and have created their own hermetically sealed world of their own. And I'm not sure democracy can survive having 30% of its people in a completely separate epistemological world.
And this is so key to me. Like, this is why it's not a both sides problem, because we got to distinguish here. Like, remember, everyone's got confirmation bias. Everyone motivated reasoning. We're all doing that. But in the divorce, one side got the actual institutions that do a pretty good job of producing knowledge, and the other side didn't get any of them. Like, that's the key here, is that, like, there are all kinds of criticism of modern science and scientific production. There are all sorts of studies that come out. There's a verification crisis that's happening right now. There's all sorts of criticism of modern reporting and the tropes of mainstream media. All of that stuff is important to criticize and not just like take at face value. But the universe, the institutional universe of developed rigorous processes of attempting to get the truth, the entirety of that, more or less, ended up on the left side in the epistemic divorce.
And the right created a sort of simulacrum of it that sort of apes the kind of the gestures and the tone. Like, if you look at the stuff coming out of, like, right-wing think tanks, like, it looks and even sort of sounds like like actual inquiry, right? But it's not the same thing. It's like you're acting it out without the spirit of it. Point of these regimes is not necessarily to make everyone believe their version of events, right? It's just to confuse everything, just to fill the atmosphere with smoke so that no one, and in that emotionally uncomfortable contexts, people will happily cling to a strong figure who seems to bring clarity to that situation. That is sort of autocracy 101. You make people believe that A, they're under immense threat and their way of life is under threat. B, they can't believe anything they're being told. And C, only I can fix it, right? That's the playbook. And it's, I mean, we're not even getting a particularly novel version.
No, it's so ham-fisted. It's like literally, it's like the most, it's
poorly written.
His thing is make everything as dumb as possible.
Trump might have like jolted mainstream U.S. politics out of its stupor a little bit, and maybe people are starting to realize that this is not just normal politics with two normal sides, with their extremists on both sides who believe crazy things and their moderates in the middle. Like, this whole model is not what's going on anymore, and there's actually a right-wing, white supremacist, revanchist, anti-intellectual movement in the U.S., and that is the problem. It's not a parallel, symmetrical problem. It's that movement that is the problem. Trump might have like jolted mainstream U.S. politics out of its stupor a little bit, and maybe people are starting to realize that this is not just normal politics with two normal sides, with their extremists on both sides who believe crazy things and their moderates in the middle. Like, this whole model is not what's going on anymore, and there's actually a right-wing, white supremacist, revanchist, anti-intellectual movement in the U.S., and that is the problem. It's not a parallel, symmetrical problem. It's that movement that is the problem.
America first. The first president to say it straight up.
Yes.
Exactly. The Trump doctrine. America first. The first president to say it straight up.
Yes.
Exactly. The Trump doctrine.